so.
It's so hard to like make it here.
Is out your way here. All right.
Oh, right, so that.
Hey, so, let's see here. Yeah, we're continuing on. We're gonna finish up, on evolution of the fossil record. And so we'll go over stratigraphy and how the fossil record is used to document macroevolution. I have on Canvas, there is a worksheet called the geologic timescale worksheet. I printed one out for you too. This was the last page of an exam, I don't know, some years ago or so. But basically, this is gonna be what your last page of your exam 2 looks like. It's just that I'm probably gonna change some of these lower. So anyway, at the break, you can go ahead and grab that, take a look at that. There's also one available on Canvas you can print out, but I went ahead and printed one for you. But it's kind of like, so here's the thing, it's not really it's for practice, but the idea is for you to go and look up each of the geologic timescale events and be familiar with what happens. So if you were just to answer this worksheet, I mean, that's great and everything, but if I change some of these to other things that happened during those times, and you don't really understand it, it's not gonna help you. So anyway, this is a useful tool. It looks like the last page of the exam. I'm hoping everyone gets 100% on it. But let's go ahead and get going with finishing up on macroevolution. And on Thursday, we're gonna start talking about physiological constraints. So we're still on schedule, even though we had last Thursday no class. We just got pushed out maybe half a week. So yeah. Good. Okay. So the fossil record is, in addition. So we mentioned that macroevolution is speciation, and we see speciation with potentially with allopatric species. Like things like ring species or similar species that are divided by some geographic barrier. That's the whole idea of allopatric speciation. We also see speciation with polyploidy, with fertile hybrids that become their own thing. And so that's another way that we've potentially witnessed macroevolution happening. We see macroevolution in regards to the genetic species concept, that we can track how similar or different genetically two species are, And I think I mentioned last Tuesday, that the genetic species concept is super popular because it's really easy to get a DNA fingerprint or a DNA sample, send it off to a lab and get a DNA sequence that you can compare with other species. So it's really easily available data. The problem with the genetic species concept is that there's no really like cut and dry what percent different is suitable to be a different species. We use the 2% difference because that's the human chimpanzee difference. And I think we like to kind of focus on ourselves or humans as examples. But it's clear that other mammals, you could be as much as 5% different and still be the same species. Birds and reptiles can be 10% different and still be the same species. Some insect can be 15, 20% different and still be the same species. So the genetic species concept has problems in terms of there's no cut and dry like yes, no, different species, same species answers. So that was what I was trying to portray to you. So the fossil record has also been a documentation of speciation or macroevolution. So I want to kind of go into what the basics of the fossil record are. And there's two different ways to look at it. Stratigraphy, or what's called the law of superposition, is using geological layers to interpret or infer change in species over time. And generally this is called relative dating, because all you can tell is things are older or younger in the fossil record. And then to finish up today, we'll talk about radiometric dating. Starting in the 1950s, radioisotopes could be used to apply an estimated age to fossils, and that has really helped. Okay, so let's get some background here. This is kind of like basic geology. So this is a volcano. Anyway, we're going to look at basically what, for our purposes, two different types of geologic rocks. There's a third type that I'll mention, but the two types that are really important for paleontology or looking at fossils are igneous rock. So igneous rock rocks. Okay, igneous rock basically is any rock or geologic material that derives from the Earth's core. So we have the magma or molten rock and molten iron and molten elements essentially in the Earth's core. And through various processes, that magma can push up to the surface. And so it can be things like, we can have things like volcanic rock. Volcanic rock or pumice, or granite, or basalt. There's ash. Ash is a good one. So these are all examples of igneous rock. You know that, of course, lava, we see examples in like Hawaii where the Mauna Loa volcano is active and there's a lava flow. And that's an example of like volcanic rock being produced. Or we'll have ash. I showed the picture of the island blowing up like on what Darwin might have saw in St. Iago. And that would be like an ash plume that is pushed out from the volcano. Or we even have here at Lassen, we have volcanic rocks that are strewn all about the Millville Plains because when Lassen exploded back in 1917 or so, it left behind a lot of rock. We also have like granites and basalts usually solidify under the ground and then either get pushed up or erosion happens and they get exposed. Like Shasta Valley at Whiskey Town is a great example of a granitic outcrop. It's basically a big kind of it's like a cyst of granite that everything else around it got eroded, and now we have this big granite pile left behind. So those are all igneous rocks. And that's one form of rock that we're going to talk about for useful in the fossil record. So anyway, igneous rock gets pushed up. You know, we have volcanic eruptions, and we have granitics being pushed up from the bottom or whatever. The other process that we have is erosion. And erosion is caused by rainfall and wind and weathering and waves, etc. So what happens in the erosive processes is we have, imagine, after all this igneous rock is kind of laid down, you have rainfall happening on the hill slopes, and then you have basically stuff that gets washed down the hillside. And these layers, let me get a color that actually I can write with. These layers are called sedimentary rock. I'll hold it on top here. So, sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rocks include things like mudstone, sandstone, limestone, like I mentioned with corals. When coral is produced on the edge of an island and they get buried, that's basically a sedimentary rock. Let me see what other one. Shale, another one. So anyway, this is certainly not a full inclusive list. I'm just providing you with some examples of sedimentary rocks. Basically, they get washed downhill. They settle, that's where the name sedimentary comes from. They settle into basins. But the thing with sedimentary rocks is they layer by age, and that's why we call it a relative dating type scheme. Because what happens here with sedimentary rocks is younger layers, are laid on top of older layers. So what happens here is, as erosion happens, basically new material gets laid on top of older material. And so this is where the idea of, it's called Fenno's law, but you can think of it as relative dating. Relative means that, we have relatively younger layers here and relatively older layers there. And the idea is, if you find fossils in here, let's say, for example, you find like some kind of a bones here, or you find like a snail shell here. If you find fossils, what you can say is, if fossil A and fossil B, what you can estimate or infer is that B is older than A. You don't know how much older. It could be, 1 million years older, or it could be 10 million years older. There's really no direct way to measure or know the actual age of those layers. But it's by this method, using stratigraphy and relative dating, that that the fossil record was basically put together and developed over the last 150 or so years. So in Darwin's time, fossils were seen. Darwin saw fossils, and they generally knew this idea that, fossils that were buried deeper were older than fossils that were closer to the surface. But there was no understanding of the age of the Earth back in Darwin's time. Like I said, there were many people who were arguing the Earth's less than 6,000 years old. Lyell presumed it was probably millions of years old. And now we know the Earth's about 4.5 billion years old. And so we have kind of maybe this understanding of age of fossils has only come about really in the last less than 100 years, probably less than 75 years. Okay. The third type of rock, which I won't ask you about, I just want to be kind of complete here, is the third type of rock that you can consider would be metamorphic rock. And what metamorphic rock is say for example, when sedimentary rock is buried so deep that it melts and becomes something else, that's where metamorphic rock comes from. But that's not really useful for fossil record information. So, thing to note on the exam is I'll give you an example of something that looks kind of like this, like a mountainside or a volcanic, whatever, picture of a volcano. It won't be my drawing, it'll be something else. But I'm going to ask you kind of where is the useful layers to look for fossils, and it'll be in sedimentary rock layers. So even though this is not a complete list, you'll have one of these as an example of sedimentary rock. So you only have to remember number 4, right? And then even though this isn't a complete list of igneous rock, the examples I give will be from that list I just wrote out. Okay, I'm trying to be simple, but you should be kind of aware or familiar with that. You can only really find fossils in sedimentary rock layers. You're not finding them in igneous rock layers or metamorphic. Okay, so this is an example of one of the most famous fossil beds. This is called the Burgess Shale. And what you're seeing basically here, this was a shale quarry up in British Columbia. And you can see kind of the layers upon layers upon layers. And what we're looking at basically is in these layers, you have fossils that are embedded in. Now, fossil essentially is any impression or remnants of a living organism that happened at one time. So it might be a mineralized skeleton, it might be a mineralized leaf, or it might be a footprint, or any kind of impression or remnant of a living organism. So here's some examples of fossils that are found in the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale is famous because it represents what's called the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion, happened about 560 million years ago. And that is when seemingly suddenly, when I mean suddenly, it's like within a 10 million year time period, all current animal phyla suddenly appear in the fossil record. So in the Burgess Shale are the examples of the oldest arthropods. That's like a trilobite here. Examples of the oldest worms. This is like an onychophoran worm fossil, presumably. And examples of the oldest chordates, kind of the primitive examples of what vertebrates derive from. So the Cambrian explosion is important because it's noted as when all the currently living animal phyla appear. And the interesting thing, the cool thing, is there's actually a bunch of phyla in this fossil record that don't live anymore. Like, for example, trilobites are now extinct. But there's actually whole phyla, groups of organisms that have no representatives today. So anyway, what I want to point out is this fossil progression is, for animals anyway, what we're looking at is the Cambrian as kind of like a really important moment in time, because from, potentially like sponge-like protists or, algae, etc., you suddenly have the appearance of all these various types of animals that are in the fossil record. And then what's happened is, over the course of time, these geologic time periods are noted mostly based on what types of animals are present. So even though in botany, plants have a really important fossil record also, the geologic time scale and the fossil record really is kind of animal oriented, very geared towards animals. Okay, so on this worksheet that I have here for you, what you're going to do basically is, try to find, I'll show you the website link on the Canvas page, but you're going to try to find out online using this UC Berkeley's Museum of Paleontology website, kind of some key events or key things that happen at each one of these time periods, and be prepared for being able to match, like maybe some written description for the time period. But I want to start out here with the Cambrian because that is for zoology where, you know, the sudden explosion of animal types and forms. Essentially, it's when the animals kind of appear in the fossil record. Okay, and I'm not going to go through all these. I mean, obviously, most of you have seen the Jurassic Park movie, so you know what happens kind of around Jurassic. But anyway, this is all very interesting here. So the next thing we're going to look at. So the progression, or this is what your worksheet looks like. The progression of these areas, like Cambrian, for example, that's when the Cambrian explosion, animal forms appear. Prior to the Cambrian, there's really very little evidence of any animals, and those that were like sponges or corals. Prior to the Proterozoic, there were no eukaryotes, it was all bacteria types. And prior to that, there was no life present on Earth at all, or no life in the fossil record present. The interesting thing is that putting a year or putting some kind of a time on this really didn't happen until about the 1950s, 1960s. And it is, it's still actively being worked on today. So the actual dates, what you'll find when you do your research on the UC Berkeley's Museum Paleontology site is you'll see these numbers are slightly different. And so like if this worksheet says 570 million years is where the Cambrian is, and if the UC Berkeley website says 560 million years, understand that there is, you know, some uncertainty. There's some like we don't exactly know the exact time, but it's like plus or minus 10 million years, you know, when you're going back to the Cambrian time. So don't be what do you call it, like anxious that what you see online is slightly different numbers. It's not the numbers that are super important. And in fact, on the worksheet, I give you all the years estimates and the names. You don't have to remember any of these period names. You just have to kind of know what happened at each one of these time periods. What I want to finish up this morning talking about is how did the estimate of these ages come from? What was the tools used to estimate the age? And that would be radiometric dating. So radioisotope or radiometric dating, obviously we're looking at radioactive isotopes of elements. And the understanding of this really only happened with like the Manhattan Project. Think of like Marie Curie and then the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. So 1930s and 40s, understanding of nuclear chemistry, nuclear physics appeared. And geophysicists kind of grabbed onto this as a way to estimate how old materials are. So there's a number of different techniques for estimating the age of rock using radiometric isotopes. I'm only going to talk about two of them. I only want you to understand how two work, because those were the ones that were used mostly to develop the fossil record time period. So that's these two. Carbon-14 and potassium-40 are the two that are the most common. I'll explain how those work. These are really not used much anymore. Carbon-14, I'll argue or I'll present that it's not really useful for zoology. So carbon-14 is more for like anthropology. Potassium-40 is useful, but only in a limited context. Today, uranium-lead isotopes are used as the most accurate method today. It's just that it's so complicated to explain how that works. It's not even worth it. But what I will say is that what the estimates that were developed using potassium-40 have been kind of refined and verified and back double-checked using uranium-lead. So we'll go ahead and describe carbon-14 and then potassium-40, and I think that'll get us to the end of it. We good? Okay, everyone cool? All right, carbon-14 dating. This is the one that you hear mostly about. For example, if you watch like Discovery Channel and they talk about finding like a frozen mammoth in the Siberian tundra or something, you'll hear about them using carbon isotope data. Or if you hear about archaeologists finding like scrolls or artifacts in Egypt or the Middle East, you'll hear about them using carbon-14 dating to estimate possibly how old those are. So how carbon-14 dating works is this, so a little bit about isotopes here. So we have, in the atmosphere, in our atmosphere, we have mostly nitrogen. So if we look at our atmosphere today, we're looking at about nitrogen is roughly 78% of our atmospheric gas. It's the most abundant gas in the atmosphere. Oxygen today makes up roughly 21% of the atmosphere. And so 78 plus 21 is what, 99, right? We're close to 99. The remaining 1% is mostly argon. And we'll come back to argon. But it's a little bit less than 1%. But argon makes up about 1%. We're not talking about potassium argon right now. We're talking about carbon-14 dating. But we'll come back to this one. So I know that, doing the math, this is 100%, but it's actually, just a little bit under 100%. Carbon dioxide, CO2, makes up really a pretty small quantity. I'm going to totally kind of round this up here, but it's basically 0.04%. So carbon dioxide makes up a very small amount of our atmosphere. But what we're using basically is the carbon from carbon dioxide as a measure in carbon-14 dating. Okay, so there's several different kinds of carbon. There is carbon 12. Carbon 12 is the most abundant carbon that is available on Earth or in the system, probably in the solar system. Carbon 12 is considered to be the stable version of carbon. If you look back at the periodic table behind us, those of you who had chemistry know that carbon has 6, well, let's go ahead and show why carbon 12 is what it is. We have, let me see here, let me get some neat colors here. We have 6 protons, we have 6 neutrons, and we have 6 electrons, is what carbon 12 is. And again, I'm not worried about this for this class, but basically, in order to get 12, it's basically 6 plus 6, and the atomic mass, if you combine the protons and neutrons, makes it atomic mass of 12. So 6 protons and 6 neutrons makes for carbon 12. So this is the most abundant carbon found in nature. But there are a couple different kinds of isotopes of carbon. There's carbon-13, carbon-14, and what those are basically is varying numbers of neutrons. You can have 7 neutrons or 8 neutrons, and that's how the varying isotopes of carbon are formed. So how that works is in the atmosphere, we have carbon dioxide is in our atmosphere, and it's mostly carbon-12 carbon dioxide, mostly carbon-12. So what happens here is, let me see if I can get an example here. So here we go. CO2, and this is carbon-12 CO2. In the outer atmosphere, cosmic rays or cosmic radiation. So this is cosmic radiation comes into the outer atmosphere and it hits let me fix this here. I gotta fix something here, sorry. Oops, got ahead of myself. So what we got going on here is nitrogen. Here we go. Back. Nitrogen, which nitrogen is a 7 protons. Here we go. That's it. Let me get this fixed. We got 7 protons, 7 neutrons, and 7 electrons with nitrogen. So anyway, nitrogen being the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, the cosmic rays come in and cosmic radiation comes in and hits nitrogen, being the most abundant gas in the atmosphere. What it does, and I know I'm not a nuclear physics understanding person, but my understanding of this is the cosmic radiation basically knocks out a proton out of the nucleus of nitrogen. And as a result, what happens is it gets replaced by a neutron. And I think what really happens here is not that the proton gets ejected and a neutron comes from nowhere. I think the proton basically gets knocked over into a neutron status by the cosmic radiation. So you can kind of think of this as being cyclical. So as a result, what happens is, because now we have nitrogen with 6 protons, so because we've knocked a proton out, we can turn this into 6 protons. And by definition, if you have 6 protons, your atomic number is 6, you become carbon. So basically nitrogen is turned into carbon in the outer atmosphere by knocking a proton out of the nucleus. And because the neutron replaced the proton, now we have 8 neutrons. And I'm going to ignore the electrons for right now. Electrons basically adjust themselves. So anyway, this is what makes carbon-14, is because we have an extra, 2 extra neutrons relative to carbon, or 1 extra to nitrogen. So anyway, carbon-14 is radiometrically or radio unstable. It's not very stable. And what happens is over time, you have radiation, essentially like alpha radiation. And over time, what happens is this will radio decay back to nitrogen. What happens is the neutrons slowly kind of convert back into nitrogen over time because these are unstable. As the radiation is released, one by one, neutrons are kind of being converted back into protons, and this is converted back into nitrogen-14. So anyway, how this works is the CO2 in the atmosphere. So CO2 gets carbon-12 in a ratio of CO2 that's carbon-14 is like a 10, and it's easy to remember because it's about the same number here. It's about 10 to 12 to 1. And what that means is there is like way more carbon-12 than carbon-14. If you remember from your chemistry class, 10 to the 12 is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's that to 1. I don't know if there's a word for that large of a number. Basically 10 to the 12 quantity of carbon-12 versus carbon-14. So what happens then is as this radio decays back into nitrogen-14, the ratio becomes larger. Like this becomes like 10 to the 13 to 1, 10 to the 14 to 1, 10 to the 15 to the 1. So slowly over time what happens is the amount of carbon-14 decays away and is replaced basically by carbon-12. So how this works then is mostly plants, but also algae and corals, etc. So let's say, for example, here's a plant, and we have plants that are being built or produced by consuming carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis processes, whether it's plants or algae or corals or whatever, they're basically absorbing carbon dioxide to build their tissues. And while they're living, they have a ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 of this kind of ratio of 10 to 12 to 1, right? So they have a ratio that resembles or is the same as the atmosphere. So this carbon-12 to carbon-14 ratio here is this 10 to the 12 to 1 ratio in the living plant. But when the plant dies, there's no longer an exchange of carbon dioxide with the atmosphere. So when the plant dies, basically, this number becomes larger and that number becomes smaller. And so what happens then is if we have like the plant, think of like the plant dying here, you know, and being buried, and now becoming like, you know, wood or, so dead wood. What happens then is the carbon-12 ratio to carbon-14 ratio, this number becomes bigger and that number becomes smaller because the carbon-14 basically is being converted into nitrogen-14. So the carbon-14 slowly goes away and is converted to nitrogen-14. So how you measure carbon-14 dating is you find organic material, anything that was previously organic material. Wood, you can find like charcoal, you can find like limestone, snail shells, or coral, or any remnant of organic material. You take a small sample and put it in a mass spectrometer machine. Mass spectrometer basically heats up the sample and projects it against a detector, and you can measure the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14. If carbon-12 to carbon-14 is similar to what's in the atmosphere, the sample is recent. If the carbon-12 to carbon-14 is mostly, or if the carbon-14 is smaller, it means it's relatively older. And how that works is there's a half-life. The half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. And how that works here is, so in 5,730 years, half of the carbon-14 that's available will be converted into nitrogen. And so that number basically will be cut in half in a 5,740 year time period. It's cut in a quarter, half of half, in a 11,500 year time period, and so on and so on. So the problem with carbon-14 is this, and this is what I want you to know for this is the main important thing, is the useful range of carbon-14 is only, well, it has to be at least 100 years old, sample, before you can begin to even detect that there's some missing carbon-14. So the machinery that we have is sensitive enough that it has to be, about 100 years old before you can even know that it's beginning to lose carbon-14. But the maximum useful range is only about 30 to 60,000 years. This is an older slide. At the time, it was 30,000 years old. Sample was the useful time. I think now, 20 years later, it's closer to 60,000 years useful time. It doesn't really matter. The actual number of the maximum age is irrelevant because, as you know, in order for speciation to happen, you have to have like 10,000 generations, right? And 10,000 generations, like for a salamander, takes 10, 20,000 years, right? So even a recent speciation event would be very, very difficult to really evaluate using carbon-14 dating. So the punchline, the main message is carbon-14 dating, I think, is the most widely talked about, the most widely understood use of radiometric dating for dating things like the Dead Sea Scrolls or artifacts in ancient Egypt, in pyramids, or the Mayan pyramids. So for archaeology, and if you want to know like when the first Native Americans showed up in California, possibly, that has been estimated using carbon-14 dating because 30 to 60,000 years is essentially useful for early human settling colonization. But here's the answer for the test. Carbon-14 is really never useful for paleontology because it just doesn't have an old enough useful range, okay? So on the exam, I'll probably ask you, for the example, what radiometric dating technique would be most appropriate? And I'm just going to tell you now, don't write carbon-14. Or you could write carbon-14 is not useful because it just doesn't measure old enough to really be applicable, okay? All right, so now that I've spent all this time talking about a dating technique that doesn't work for us, why I did was because you hear about carbon-14 the most on the Discovery Channel or through the research. Everyone talks about carbon-14 because it's probably one of the, I think it's the oldest, most established radiometric technique, but it's not useful for fossils. Potassium argon, though, is useful for fossil dating. Okay, how potassium argon works is, if you look at potassium back there on the periodic table, what does it say? What's the atomic number of potassium? 15? P, right? Oh, phosphorus K. K, okay, 19. K, 19. Better revoke my chemistry. Okay, K is 19. So potassium is the stable form of potassium here is potassium 38. Right, 19 plus 19 is 38, right? Because it has 19 protons, it has 19 neutrons, and 19 electrons. Okay, so that's the stable form of potassium. Most of the potassium is found in the biggest source of potassium is in the magma or in the igneous magma pools at the center of the Earth, like a major element kind of found in igneous rocks. There is a unstable isotope of potassium called potassium-40, and it's basically a unstable isotope that is already present. And obviously, what it is it has same kind of thing. We knock a proton out and add some neutrons, but basically it's essentially like 19 protons and 21 neutrons. Potassium-40. Potassium-40 radio decays into argon. And if you look at argon's atomic number there, right, is 18. Okay, so argon basically is a stable, what do you call it, noble gas, right? Argon is one of the noble gases, meaning that once argon is established, it really doesn't react with many things. So from chemistry, you know that all those things in the right-hand column are kind of non-reactive, solo elemental molecules, right? Basically an element by himself. So this is happening in the Earth's magma at all times. Basically, the potassium-40 that's there, which was established when the Earth was formed, is decomposing into argon. But what happens here is when volcanic eruptions happen, the argon goes out into the atmosphere. And that is the source of our 1% argon in the atmosphere, is volcanic bursts, right? You have essentially volcanoes emit gas from the core of the Earth, and that 1% of argon is basically the result of volcanic activity over the course of Earth's history. So the argon, because it's a gas, and because it's non-reactive, once it's established, it stays, just goes out into the atmosphere and hangs out in the atmosphere. The potassium, though, ends up as igneous rock material, like ash, volcanic material, pumice, granite, basalt, etc. So what happens here is potassium-40 basically is the only version of this 40 atomic mass unit material that's found in ash, pumice, granite, basalt when it's first laid down. So what you do basically is you look for layers of ash. So maybe this is like ash, or maybe this is lava rocks. And those layers are usually associated with sedimentary rock layers. I mean, they kind of behave like sedimentary rock layers because they're pushed out by volcanic eruptions and potentially lay down as a sedimentary layer. So what you do is for the potassium argon technique is you find igneous rock material, volcanic rock, pumice, lava rock. Those are all great examples of materials that you would use for sampling potassium argon. And then you can say that, maybe there's a specific age range. Maybe this is, 20 million years ago, and this is 40 million years ago. And so you can put a date on those layers using the radiometric technique, because the half-life is so much larger than carbon-14. The useful range is actually quite good. Potassium argon can measure things as young as 100,000 years old. We could measure some recent 100,000-year-old volcanic activity all the way to the oldest rocks on Earth. The Earth is presumed to be maybe a little older than 4.5 billion years old. But basically, you could measure the oldest volcanic rocks present on the planet, go all the way back to before life even existed. So what the limiting factor is, like you couldn't use this to measure like a woolly mammoth. The woolly mammoth was about 30,000 years ago, but you could use it to measure, like, say, for example, when you think dinosaurs went extinct, right? So it's for much older processes. So 100,000 years is the minimum age you can use, and there really is no maximum because it's the oldest rocks on Earth, so there's no constraints. So you take a ash sample, you take it to a mass spectrometer, kind of like you did with the carbon-14, and you calculate the ratio of potassium-40, because this will basically radio decay back into argon-40. So you're looking at, if you find a sample and it's all potassium-40 and no argon, you know it's less than 100,000 years old. If you find a very tiny bit of argon, it might be 100,000 to millions of years old. But you can measure samples as much as 20 million, 40 million, all the way to hundreds of millions of years old. But the limiting factor for this is you can't measure the fossils directly. You have to measure ash or volcanic or igneous layers that are around the fossils. So all we can say here is this fossil is between 20 and 40 million years old. And then all we can say here is this fossil is older than 40 million years old, right? You don't know the exact age, but you know it's between brackets of age, right? So, so the potassium-argon method is what was used to establish and develop the geologic timescale dates over the last, say, 75 years. And it's been refined over that time period. So the potassium-argon one is the most useful one. So on the exam, when I ask you what radiometric method would be useful here, you write potassium-argon, right? And then maybe you could identify on the little chart that I draw, where might you find a sample of that? You're going to look for the ash or the lava type material, right? That's all I'm going to ask you on this. Today, I think the uranium-lead method is the one that is the most applicable because this uses silica sand mostly to measure this. What they've done basically is the uranium-lead has been used to kind of proof or secondarily check the results for potassium-argon, and it's helped to refine the radiometric dating method. It's just that the uranium-lead method is so complicated to explain, it's not even worth it. So I think it were good enough for you to appreciate that potassium-argon is the method that paleontologists have used in the past. And again, that carbon-14, even though it's the most widely talked about, like on Discovery Channel or in the news or what have you, is not really useful for zoology. Okay? Sound good? Yeah, I've said about 100 times now, but I'm trying to get it through. Okay, I think that that gets us for ending macroevolution. So we're leaving chapter 19 and we're going to move on Thursday, we're going to get into physiological constraints that animals have, water balance issues, respiration, things like that. So that'll take Thursday and then next Tuesday. And so for the rest of this time into the exam 2, we're looking at how animals basically adapt to their environments with salinity in fresh water versus oxygen concentration versus food supplies, etc. So that's kind of our plan there. Let me show you real quick before we go, and then we have the handout here. Is we have just log in here real quick. Just show you some resources. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into Canvas. There's a couple cool sites here. Student view. Okay, so we have lecture exam 2 content here, and there's basically this is essentially like what I just blah 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 about. That's a video from COVID times about that. And then we have this. I think this is a like a little YouTube video on the geologic timescale and fossils. It's kind of like a secondary benefit there. This is the worksheet I just gave you, and this is I printed it out for you, but it's available here. So I'm on the this is the page from I think an exam a couple years ago, but this will be exactly the same. This top part showing you the geologic time period eras and epochs and the years will be exactly the same. What will be different is I might rearrange these and I might change some of these to reflect some different events that happen in these. Some of them will be the same, like, there's only one thing I can really say about the Cambrian, and that is, let's see, the Cambrian. The oldest fossils of trilobites and annelid worms are found here. So basically, the oldest animal fossils are found in the Cambrian. So your job is you're going to see if you can kind of match these events into those little boxes. Same thing with the Hadean. The Hadean here, which is 3.8 to 4.5 million years old, there's no evidence of any life present on Earth. So there's really only one thing I could ask there, right? I can't really change that one up. But as you get more recent, there's a wider variety of things that happened in animal history or zoology history. And so that's kind of what makes it more interesting, okay? So again, I recommend practicing this early and then going to the site and investigating this. Let me show you the site here I want you to check out, or you can look at other sites too. But this is the UC Museum of Paleontology's website, UC Berkeley. And they have this great site where you can go to all these time periods. Let's see, for example, what they say about the Cambrian. So, and usually within the first 2 paragraphs, there will be, a couple sentences that represent what happened in animal history. So, so the Cambrian period marks an important point of history. It's when most of the major groups of animals first appear in the fossil record, called the Cambrian explosion. So usually within the first paragraph, you'll get some information that you could write down and take notes about what happened there, okay? So this is a really interesting site. And let me see what else we have here in this. I also have a little kind of a YouTube video summarizing potassium argon dating and radiocarbon dating. I don't think they're as useful as what I just described to you here. So but these are just some additional backgrounds. Okay, sound good? All right, let's go ahead and take like a long 10-minute break. We'll do 9, 10, 10 after. We're going to go into the mollusks today. We're going to